A rancher ordered a wife through the mail. What arrived at the station was an orc woman with nothing but a paper name tag pinned to her dress and a silence that suggested she had already braced herself for him to send her back. The town of Coldwater Bend sat at the end of a rail line that most maps didn't bother to include. It was the kind of place where the wind did most of the talking, and the people who lived there had learned to do most of their listening in silence. Ezra Whitlock had lived on the edge of that town for 11 years, on a ranch that had once belonged to his father, and, before that, to nobody at all, because the land out there hadn't wanted to belong to anybody until somebody was stubborn enough to make it. Ezra was 34 years old, and he moved like a man who had already used up the parts of himself that hurried. He woke before the sun most mornings, not because he had to, but because sleeping past it felt like a kind of surrender he wasn't willing to make. He fed the horses, he mended fences that didn't need mending. He sat at a table built for 4, and ate alone, and had done so for 3 years, ever since the fever took his wife Sarah in a single terrible week that he still could not entirely remember, except for the parts he could never forget. He had written to the agency in the spring, on a night when the quiet of the house had pressed down on him harder than usual. It wasn't romance he was looking for. He told himself that, plainly, the way he told himself most things, without decoration. He needed another set of hands on a ranch too big for one man, and if those hands came attached to a person he could talk to over supper, he supposed that wouldn't hurt either. He'd paid the fee. He'd waited. He had not expected much, and so, in a strange way, he had already prepared himself to be disappointed. He had not prepared himself for this. The train came in on a Tuesday, late in the afternoon, with the sun low and orange and stretching long shadows down the platform. Ezra stood by the water tower in his one clean shirt, turning his hat over in his hands, and watched the passengers come down the steps, one by one, an old man with a cane, a family with too many trunks, a drummer selling something in tin cans, and then, last of all, stepping down slow and careful, like she expected the ground itself might refuse to hold her, was her. She was tall, taller than him by an inch or two, with skin the color of river clay, and tusks that showed faintly when her mouth was closed, just the tips of them pressing gentle dents into her lower lip. Her hair was black and pulled back tight into a braid that fell past her shoulder. She wore a traveling dress the color of weak tea, plain and clearly not her own choosing, and pinned to the collar of it was a small square of paper, the kind you tie to a crate of dishes to mark where it was headed. Ezra could see handwriting on it from 20 feet away, small and careful, and he felt his stomach drop through the platform boards. He walked closer, because there was nothing else to do, and the crowd was thinning, and she was still standing there with a single carpetbag held in front of her with both hands like a shield. He read the tag once. It said a name. Below the name, in the same careful hand, it said, "Property of no one. Destination Coldwater Bend. In care of E. Whitlock." He read it a second time, slower, and something about the way the letters were formed, so deliberate, so unhurried, like whoever wrote it wanted to be sure it couldn't be misread or torn away or denied, made the back of his throat go tight in a way he did not understand and did not have time to examine. She was watching him read it. He could feel her watching him, the way you feel weather changing before you see the clouds. Her chin was lifted, not in defiance exactly, but in the particular posture of someone who has decided in advance that whatever happens next, she will not flinch from it. "There's been some kind of mistake," Ezra said, and the words left his mouth before he had decided whether they were true. "There usually is," she said. Her voice was low and even, and it did not shake. "I can get back on the train if that's what you're deciding. I have not unpacked anything. There is nothing to undo." He looked at her a moment longer. He looked at the tag again. "Property of no one." He thought about who writes a thing like that on a piece of paper, meant to travel with a person, and what kind of a hand does it carefully. Like it mattered that the words came out right. He did not answer her question. Instead, he reached out and picked up her bag. It was heavier than it looked, or maybe he was just tired, in a way that had nothing to do with the bag at all. She did not let go of it right away. Her hand stayed on the handle a half-second longer than it needed to, her eyes searching his face, for the catch, the trick, the moment where the kindness turned out to be the setup for something crueler. Seth. He had seen that look before in a different context, on wounded animals that had been kicked enough times to distrust an open hand, even when it carried food. "I've got a wagon," he said. "It's a 2-hour ride. You'll want your shawl. The wind picks up after sundown." She let go of the bag. They didn't speak much on the ride out. Ezra kept his eyes mostly on the road, partly out of habit and partly because he did not trust his face not to show the confusion still working through him. The sun dropped the rest of the way while they rode, and the sky went the color of a healing bruise, purple and orange and low gray at the edges, and the woman beside him sat with her hands folded in her lap and her carpet bag between her boots, looking out at the land like she was trying to memorize an escape route, or maybe just trying to find something in it worth memorizing at all. "My name is Ezra," he said. When the silence had gone on so long, it started to feel like its own kind of rudeness. "I know," she said. "It was on the tag, right?" He adjusted his grip on the reins. "I didn't catch yours properly. Wasn't sure if the tag was using your right name or just what the agency called you." She was quiet a moment. "Mara," he said. "It's my right name." "I've had it since before any of this, Mara," he repeated, testing the shape of it. It was a plain name, unadorned, and something in him appreciated that it did not try to be anything other than what it was. She turned her head slightly, studying him with an expression that was hard to place, something between suspicion and the exhausted beginning of hope, the kind you keep on a short leash because you've been burned trusting it before. "You're not going to ask," she said. "Ask what?" "Why an orc woman came off that train instead of whatever soft, pale thing you were expecting." Ezra kept his eyes on the road. The horse's hooves fell steady against the packed dirt, and somewhere off in the scrub, a nightbird was starting up its evening complaint. "I figure you'll tell me if you want to," he said. "And if you don't want to, then asking's just me being greedy for a story that isn't mine to have." She didn't answer that. But he noticed, out of the corner of his eye, that her shoulders had come down from around her ears just slightly, the way a person's do when a held breath finally gets let out. The ranch house came into view a little after full dark, a low shape against the stars, with one window lit from a lamp Ezra had left burning, a habit from years back that he'd never broken, even though there was no longer anyone left to worry over whether he made it home. He helped her down from the wagon. Her hand in his was rough with old calluses, and he registered that fact the way he registered most things now, quietly filing it away without comment. Inside, the house was clean but spare, bachelor's kind of clean, everything in its place, because there was no one to disturb the places. He lit a second lamp and showed her to the small back room that had been his sister's before she married, and moved to Abilene, a narrow bed and a chest of drawers and a window that looked out over the north pasture. "It's not much," he said. "It's a door that closes," Mara said. "That's more than I've had in some time." He didn't ask what that meant. He only nodded and told her breakfast was early and left her to the quiet of the room and went to his own bed with a head full of questions he had decided, for tonight at least, not to chase. He lay awake a long while anyway. The next weeks moved the way early spring moves on a ranch, slow and full of small necessary tasks that added up to survival. Mara rose before he expected her to, every morning, and by the time he came in from the horses, she had the stove going and something simple cooking, oats or cornbread or whatever the pantry allowed, and she ate across the table from him in a silence that was at first heavy, with things neither of them said. She did not wait to be told what needed doing. That was the first thing Ezra noticed, and the thing that surprised him most. Within the first week she had found the loose plank in the henhouse and fixed it herself with nails she'd found in his shed. Done neat, done right, no fuss made about it, and no mention of it either, until he noticed on his own and asked. She worked the garden beds with an efficiency that told him she had done this kind of labor before somewhere, for someone, and had not always been thanked for it. "Where'd you learn to mend fence like that?" he asked one afternoon, watching her twist wire with a practiced hand while he held the post steady. "Wherever I was," she said. "You learn quick when the alternative is being useless." "Useless doesn't get fed, where I come from." He wanted to ask where that was. He didn't. He'd learned already that her sentences had edges, soft-spoken, but sharp if you pressed on them the wrong way. And he had decided, without deciding it out loud, that he would let her hand him the pieces of her story when she was ready to, rather than dig for them like a man panning for something he had a right to. They worked side by side through most of the daylight hours. He taught her the particular rhythm of his land, which pasture flooded in heavy rain, which gate stuck in the cold, how the mare Clementine needed a gentler hand than the gelding did. She taught him things, too, though she seemed almost embarrassed to be doing it. Corrections offered sideways without direct instruction. A better way to brace a post against wind. A trick for keeping bread from going stale so fast in dry heat. Small things. Practical things. The currency of two people who did not yet trust each other with words, but were slowly, wordlessly, proving themselves reliable with their hands. At night they still ate, mostly in silence, but the silence had started to change its character. It was no longer the silence of two strangers waiting for the other to make the first mistake. It had become something closer to the silence of people who were tired in the same way, from the same work, and found a kind of company in that shared exhaustion even without conversation to fill it. It was on a night in the fourth week, when a spring storm had rolled in and pinned them both indoors, that Mara spoke first about her past, and she did it the way Ezra had learned she did most things, plainly, without asking for pity, and without much warm-up at all. They were sitting by the stove. Rain hammered the tin roof in a steady percussion, and the lamp between them threw a small circle of orange light that didn't quite reach the corners of the room. "I had a husband before this," she said, and Ezra went very still. The way you go still around something wild that has decided, on its own terms, to come close. Among my own people. He was not a kind man. I want to say that plainly, so you understand what I mean when I say the agency was not the worst thing that ever happened to me. It was, in its way, an escape, even though nobody meant it as one. Ezra said nothing. He had a mending awl in his hand, working a strap of leather that did not need working, giving his hands something to do so his face would not have to do all the work of listening. "He is why I have this," she said, and touched a place along her jaw, a thin pale line in the clay brown of her skin that Ezra had noticed the first week and had never once let himself ask about. There were others like it in other places. I am not telling you this so you'll pity me. I'm telling you because you should know what you took on when you picked up that bag at the station. I am not new to this. I am not soft. I do not startle easy anymore. But there are certain things, certain postures a man can take, certain tones of voice, that will make me leave a room before I've decided to leave it. My body decides before I do. Ezra set the awl down. The rain kept on outside, steady, indifferent, the way weather always was to the small wars going on beneath its shelter. "I lost my wife 3 years back," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he meant it to fever. "Fast, but not fast enough. That I didn't have time to watch it happen and not be able to do a single thing about it. I haven't talked about her much to anybody, not because I don't want to remember her, because I remember her too much, and talking about it makes the missing sharper instead of duller, and I got tired of sharpening it." He looked up at her. "I'm telling you that. So, you know, I'm not new to grief either. Different shape than yours. But I know what it is to carry something that doesn't show on the outside and still weighs a person down every day, regardless." Mara looked at him a long moment, her dark eyes steady in the lamplight, and something passed between them that was not quite forgiveness and not quite trust, but was the seed both of those things eventually grow from. "Thank you," she said, "for not saying you understand exactly what it's like. Everybody says that. Nobody understands exactly what anything is like." "No," he agreed, "but I understand carrying something. That much I do know." They sat a while longer in the sound of the rain, and when Mara finally rose to go to bed, she paused by his chair and set her hand briefly just for a moment on his shoulder. It was the first time she had touched him without either of them asking it of the other, for some practical purpose. He sat with the warmth of that hand long after she'd gone, staring into the stove's low coals, feeling something in his chest that he had not let himself feel in 3 years, Not quite hope, but the doorway that hope walks through. A few days later, Mara did something Ezra would remember for a long time afterward, though at the time it seemed a small thing. She had noticed, the way she noticed most things about the house without being told, that there was a drawer in the kitchen dresser that Ezra never opened, and that he flinched, just barely, whenever anyone reached toward it. Inside, though she did not know this, yet was a folded blue dress, a hairpin, and a letter Sarah had started writing to her sister and never finished. One evening, while Ezra was out checking the horses in the last of the light, Mara set the table with a small jar of wildflowers she'd gathered from the fence line, purple ones, the kind that grew stubborn in the poorest soil. When Ezra came in and saw them, something in his face went tight, and Mara, watching him carefully from across the room, spoke before he could. "I am not trying to take anything," she said, "or replace anything. I only thought the table looked like it needed some color. If it troubles you, I'll throw them out." Ezra stood a moment with his hat still in his hand. "No," he said finally. "Leave them. She would have liked them. She always said this place needed more color, and I never did anything about it." It was the first time he had spoken of Sarah to Mara directly, using her name, and something in the saying of it loosened a knot in his chest that had been there 3 years without him fully realizing its shape. Mara did not press him further. She only nodded and turned back to the stove and let the moment settle the way you let bread settle after it's been kneaded, without disturbing it before its time. The following week, Ezra did something in return, though he would not have called it a return at the time. He had gone into town for supplies and came back with a small paper packet of tea, a kind Mara had mentioned once offhand that she used to drink somewhere in her past and hadn't tasted in years. But he set it on the table without comment and went back out to the barn before she could say anything about it, because he found, to his own quiet surprise, that he did not want thanks for it. He only wanted her to have it. That was, he supposed later, the moment things between them had genuinely begun to shift, though neither of them marked it out loud. Symbols matter more than speeches in a life like the one they were building. A jar of flowers. Well, a packet of tea. The small currency of 2 careful people learning, slowly, that the other one could be trusted with more than chores. The town of Coldwater Bend, however, did not extend the same patience. It was inevitable, Ezra supposed, that word would travel. A rancher living alongside an Orc woman, unmarried, in the eyes of the law and the church both, was the kind of thing that small towns turned over in their mouths, like a piece of gristle they couldn't quite spit out or swallow. He noticed the stares. First at the mercantile, when he went in for flour, and the woman behind the counter looked at him a beat too long before ringing up his purchase. He noticed it at church, which he attended less now but still enough to be recognized, in the way conversations dimmed when he walked past a cluster of neighbors on the steps. He said nothing about it to Mara at first, thinking he could shield her from it, the way he'd shield her from a hailstorm, simply by standing between her and the weather. But Mara was not a woman who needed shielding from the truth, and she made that clear to him one evening when he came back from town more quiet than usual. "They're talking," she said. "It wasn't a question. Some," he admitted. "I've had worse said about me in rooms. I could hear it in. Quiet talk behind my back is almost restful by comparison." But the quiet talk did not stay quiet for long. The trouble arrived, as trouble in these stories tends to, in the shape of a man who believed the world owed him something it had not yet paid. His name was Cutter Boyle, and he ran the largest spread outside Coldwater Bend, and he had, some years back, made an offer for Ezra's land that Ezra had turned down flat, a grudge Boyle had nursed patiently ever since, the way some men nurse grudges as a kind of hobby. Boyle had also, it turned out, once dealt with the very agency that sent Mara west in a transaction involving Orc laborers. He'd since treated with a cruelty that had made its way in whispers back through the same channels Mara herself had traveled. He rode out to Ezra's ranch on a bright, hard morning in early summer, with 2 of his hired men flanking him, and found Ezra and Mara out by the corral working a young horse together, her hands steady on the lead rope, while Ezra murmured low encouragement to the animal. "Whitlock," Boyle called, reining up at the fence. "Heard you had yourself some company out here. Didn't believe it till I saw it with my own eyes." Ezra straightened slowly, setting the lead rope slack in his palm. "Something you need, Boyle?" "Just come to do you a favor is all." Boyle's eyes slid over to Mara with an expression that made something cold settle in Ezra's stomach, the particular contempt of a man who had decided long ago that some people were not people at all. Not fully, not in any way that required him to mind his manners. "That one's agency debt got sold twice over before it ever reached you." Whitlock papers got crossed. "I hold the second contract. Means she's mine by law, and you've been harboring what's rightfully my property for going on 2 months now." Mara's hand had gone very still on the lead rope. Ezra saw it. The stillness, the old animal wariness returning to her shoulders, the posture of someone bracing for a blow they had learned, through long and bitter practice, not to try and dodge. "She's not property," Ezra said. His voice was even, but there was something underneath it now, low and hard, like a floorboard giving warning before it breaks. "Law might disagree with you," Boyle said, almost pleasant about it, the way cruel men often are when they believe they hold the winning hand. "I've got the papers in my saddlebag. You want to see them. Agency mix-up, don't change who owns the debt. She's mine to collect, and I mean to collect her today. Unless you got some other arrangement in mind for making this easy on all of us." Ezra looked at the papers Boyle produced, a folded document with an official-looking seal, and something in him went cold and clear the way it used to go before a fight. Back in years, he did not often think about anymore. "I know this agency's paperwork," Ezra said slowly. "I've had dealings with them myself, remember. This seal's wrong. County office moved that same for the Northern District 2 years back, after the flood. This says the old seal. Which means either you're carrying a bad forgery, Boyle, or you bought a debt from somebody who never had the right to sell it. Either way, this paper's worth exactly what a lie is worth." Boyle's jaw tightened. "You calling me a liar in front of he gestured vaguely dismissively at Mara, "whatever she is to you." "I'm calling your paper a fake," Ezra said, "because that's what it is. And I'll say the rest plain. Oh, there's no confusion carried back to town with you. She's not your property. She was never your property. She is not anybody's property. She's a woman who works this land beside me every day, who has more sense and more grit than most men I've shared a bunkhouse with, and if you or anybody else rides out here again with the idea that you can just haul her off like she's a stray heifer, you'll find me standing exactly where I'm standing now, and I will not step aside." The words came out of him plain, unhurried, the way most true things came out of Ezra Whitlock, without decoration, but with a weight behind them that made even Boyle's hired men shift uneasily in their saddles. "She is my responsibility," Ezra went on, quieter now but no less firm. "And she is, if she'll have it, more than that. And I will take that claim to any judge, any circuit court, any church in this territory, and I will win it. Because the truth is on my side. And you know it, or you wouldn't have needed to forge a seal to try and take her." Boyle sat his horse a long moment, measuring the distance between his pride and his good sense. Around them, the morning had gone very quiet, even the horse in the corral, standing still, ears pricked, as if it too understood something significant was passing. It was in that silence that an unlikely voice spoke up from the fence line, where Ezra hadn't even noticed old Tobias Greer had been standing, a retired lawman who lived alone on the next parcel over, and came by every so often to trade seed and gossip. Tobias was a black man in his 60s who had worn a badge in a rougher territory decades back, and who had, Ezra knew, seen more of the ugly side of paper-thin claims to ownership than most men in the county combined. "I know that seal," Tobias said, ambling forward with the unhurried authority of a man who had spent a career being underestimated and had long since stopped minding it. "I was still wearing a badge when they changed it. Whitlock's right. That paper you're waving, Boyle wouldn't hold up in front of any judge worth his robes. I'd be happy to say so myself should this need to go further than your say-so and his." Boyle's face had gone a mottled red, the color of a man caught out and furious about the catching. "This isn't finished, Whitlock," he said, but the words had lost their teeth and everyone present could hear it. "It is, though," Ezra said. "For today, and I expect for good. You got no paper, no claim, and now a witness who'll swear to both those facts in front of anybody who asks. Right on home, Boyle." Boyle held his stare a moment longer, then wheeled his horse hard enough to kick up dust and rode off with his 2 hired men trailing after him, considerably less swaggering on the retreat than they'd been on the approach. Tobias watched them go, then turned back to Ezra and Mara, with something that might have been the ghost of a smile. "Man like that," he said. "Always looking for the easy thing to take. Never does his own checking on whether it's actually his to take in the first place." He tipped his hat toward Mara. "Ma'am, glad to see you've landed somewhere with a man willing to stand his ground for you. Don't see enough of that." He left soon after, refusing Ezra's offer of coffee, saying he'd best get back before his goats worked out how to open the gate again, a joke that felt, in the wake of what had just happened, like a small mercy, a return to the ordinary shape of the day. Ezra turned to Mara once the dust of Boyle's departure had settled. She was still holding the lead rope, though the horse had wandered off to graze at the far end of the corral, forgotten in the tension of the last several minutes. Her eyes were bright, glassy, in a way he hadn't seen from her before. Not tears, exactly. Or not only tears, but something that looked like the release of a held breath she had been holding, he suspected, for a great deal longer than the length of that conversation. "You didn't have to say all that," she said, her voice not quite steady. "I meant all that," Ezra said. "Every word of it." "Nobody's ever stood in front of me like that," she said. "Not once. Not in all the years before this one." "Well," Ezra said, and found that his own voice wasn't as steady as he'd have liked either. "Seems like somebody should have." She crossed the distance between them, the horse forgotten entirely now, and Ezra found himself reaching for her before he had entirely decided to, and she let him, her forehead coming to rest against his shoulder, and they stood like that a long moment, in the settling dust, in the ordinary light of an ordinary morning that had, in the space of 10 minutes, become something else entirely. It was 3 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon with the kind of soft gold light that only seems to happen in early autumn, that Ezra asked her plainly, the way he did most things. They were sitting on the porch steps, a pot of the tea he'd brought her months back, steeping in a jar between them, and he turned to her without much ceremony and said, "I'd like to marry you properly. Not because the paper matters more than what we've already built here, but because I want the whole territory to know it, the way Boyle and everyone like him needs to know it. I want your name next to mine in the county book, not because a bad seal or an agency mix-up put you here, but because I'm choosing it plainly, with my whole chest, and I'd like you to choose it too, if you're willing." Mara was quiet a long moment, turning her cup in her hands. "I came here with a name tag," she said finally. "Property of no one. I wrote that myself, you know, before I got on that train. I didn't want anybody who received me thinking they'd bought something. I wanted it understood from the first moment that whatever I was not for owning." "I remember," Ezra said. "I read it twice." "I know," she said. "I saw you read it twice. That was the first moment I thought maybe you were a different sort of man than the ones I'd known." "I'd like to write something new," Ezra said, "if you'll let me. Not a tag, something better." "What would it say?" He thought about it a long moment, the way he thought about most things, slow and careful, wanting to get it right rather than getting it fast. "Mara Whitlock," he said. "Chosen, not assigned, home, not delivered." She laughed. Then a real laugh, low and surprised out of her, the first one he'd heard since she stepped off that train, and it was, he thought, one of the finest sounds he had heard in 3 long years of quiet. "That's a mouthful for a name tag," she said. "Good thing it's going in the county book instead," he said, "where there's more room." They were married the following month, in a small ceremony at the ranch house with Tobias Greer standing as witness, and a handful of neighbors who had, in the months since Boyle's failed claim, quietly come around to a different way of thinking about the woman living out past the north pasture. It was not a large wedding. It did not need to be. What mattered was said plainly, in front of the people who mattered, the way most true things in Ezra's life had always been said. In the years that followed, the ranch grew the way land grows when it is tended by 2 people instead of 1. Steadily, without much drama, but with a kind of quiet accumulation that added up, over seasons, to something neither of them could have built alone. They took in a niece of Mara's some years later, a quiet, watchful girl named Yura, who had lost her own family to a border conflict 2 territories over, and who arrived at their door in much the same state Mara herself once had, wary and expecting little, and who found in that house the same slow unfolding of trust that Mara had found before her. It was Yura, a few years into her time with them, who asked Ezra the question that seemed to settle, for good, the shape of everything that had come before. Was it strange, she asked him one evening, helping him mend a bridle by lamplight, in the blunt way children have of asking the questions adults spend years avoiding. Getting a wife you didn't order? An orc? When you asked for something else? Ezra considered this a long moment, the leather warm and worn beneath his fingers. I ordered somebody to share this ranch with, he said. I didn't know yet what I actually needed, which was somebody to share my life with. Turned out the agency didn't make a mistake at all. They just understood something about me faster than I understood it about myself. Yura seemed to accept this the way children accept most true things, without much fuss, and went back to her work on the bridle, and Ezra sat back and watched the lamplight flicker across the room where his wife stood at the stove, her braid loose over one shoulder, humming something low and tuneless the way she often did when the day's work was mostly finished and the evening had gone soft and unhurried. He thought, watching her, of the name tag he still kept in the dresser drawer, folded now beside Sarah's blue dress, and the unfinished letter. Not because the two women belonged in the same box, but because he had come to understand that a heart does not run out of room the way a house sometimes seems to. It only ever finds more space than you thought it had, provided you're willing to build the extra rooms yourself, one plank at a time, the way you'd build anything worth keeping. The important parts of a life like his were never the loud parts. They were the small ones. A jar of wildflowers on a table, a packet of tea, bought without being asked for. A name read twice, slow, because something in the handwriting told him it mattered. Trust, built plank by plank, the same way you'd build a fence. Checking each post before you leaned your weight on it, because the fences that last are never the ones thrown up in a hurry. He had ordered a wife through the mail and received instead a whole life he hadn't known he was capable of wanting again. And in the end, he thought, that was the only kind of arrangement worth having, the kind where nobody actually gets exactly what they asked for, and everybody somehow still ends up with everything they needed. End quote. If you liked this story, please subscribe and follow me for more.